Hey everybody, it's Erik Torenberg, co-founder, partner of Village Global, a network-driven venture firm. And this is Venture Stories, a podcast covering topics relating to tech and business with world-leading experts. Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Venture Stories by Village Global. I'm here today joined by two very special guests, Beezer, Clarkson, and Chris Douvos, the money behind the money, two people who don't really need that much of an introduction. Guys, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having us.
This is our first LP episode, so I'm hoping it can set the tone for many to come. First, how do you guys describe the work that you do? Chris, perhaps we could start with you.
Sure. Well, my name is Chris Douvos, and I run a investment vehicle called Ahoy Capital. Most of what we do is fund to funds, but we're also starting to do more and more direct investments, particularly in deep tech.
Beezer, how do you describe the work that you do?
Sure. So I'm Beezer Clarkson with Sapphire Ventures, and Sapphire is a $2.5 billion investment firm that does two things, both direct investments in growth stage companies. That's not the work that I do, but that's the majority of the money on our platform goes into. And I manage the side of the business that does investing in early stage venture funds, or I manage the side of the business that does the LP work.
Cool. Chris, you mentioned that you're starting to go direct a little bit. Talk more about that. How has that evolution progressed and what does that mean for you?
Sure. So it's actually interesting because my investors were the ones who kind of pounded on me until we started doing direct investments because they were like, you're here in Silicon Valley. You're kind of our bird dog and you must be in the way of, a lot of interesting companies. And I said, yeah, actually, we do kind of hear about a lot of things. And we have these great trusted relationships because part of the voodoo that I do is I like to put people in business, right? So I was the first investor in First Round Capital. We did the Friends and Family Fund back in 2006 before I introduced Josh to, Princeton and Yale and Northwestern, Notre Dame, Virginia and others. More recently, I was a first investor in Data Collective. And, with each one of these, what I said is, today I'm doing a favor for you and someday I'll ask for a favor in return.
Yes.
And sure enough.
When did you suddenly become much older?
Exactly.
I'm actually channeling my dad, channeling Vito Corleone. So, but anyhow, so it's actually been awesome because being here and for a long time, I was co-officing with one of my managers. And so getting, kind of being up to speed, I found myself in the way of a lot of interesting stuff. I will say though that there are mornings when I kind of, kick myself because the very first real co-investment opportunity that I was like pitched actively was, my dear friends at First Round, and I were sitting around one day and it was when Uber was raising one of its earlier rounds and I was sitting there and Josh was like, look, we've got a little excess pro rata. If you wanted to come, we could do a little something. And then, Josh said, but the valuation, is $600 million. And I was like, saints preserve us. Who would pay $600 million, value, post-money valuation or whatever it was at the time? I'm, kind of guessing at that number, but it was still in the hundreds of millions, not billions of dollars. And I was like, that was, in retrospect, that was like, I didn't have a vehicle out of which to do it, but with, kind of 24 months of hindsight, I was like, wow, we got to start doing this. And we've been lucky to find our way into some pretty interesting things. So,
yeah. Zooming back out a little bit, why do funds of funds even exist in the first place? Could First Round not have gotten to, those endowments or maybe give a little history and context for why fund of funds serve a unique role in the market? Sure.
So there are, a ton of reasons why people might seek out a fund of funds, but most notably, if you look at it, venture is either about access or about audacity. And so there are some people for whom, and there's some people who have, some fund of funds that have incredible access, great kind of roster of brand names. And those institutions that might, Bob's College of Knowledge and Service Station Graduate School, they might not have access to X, Y, or Z fund, but they want access to venture. So they go through a fund of funds and they pay, an extra layer of fees for that access. I find myself in the audacity bucket, right? Which is I'm basically doing the shit that your investment committee won't let you do, right? So First Round Capital in 2007 was a non-obvious bet. Data Collective in 2011 was a non-obvious bet. Some of the stuff I've done more recently, like House Fund at Berkeley or E14 at MIT, those are non-obvious bets and I'm super excited about them. They might work out, they might not, but it's hard for those guys, especially at the fund size, that they're deploying for others to, for larger institutions to access them, in any kind of meaningful way. And so we can also, by the way, then help them spread around their risk by investing in a bucket of these risky managers, so that they don't have to take rifle shots.
I want to underscore something that Chris was saying. I don't have great data on this because it's not collected anywhere that one can really find, given all of the confidentiality agreements that get signed about who invests in who. But when you go through and you look at the newer managers, you typically see family offices and fund of funds putting them in business. So it's a bit of a chicken and egg, but part of the reasons why these vehicles exist is because people need them to exist. And without them, a lot of emerging managers would not happen, because it's just really hard for some of these larger platforms with larger checks, established managers they continue to be backing, to do a sufficient number of the new managers that come to market. And there is 50 to 80 new managers every year coming to market, and most of them are sub 100 million. Probably a significant percentage sub 50 million. And that just isn't going to work if you have to write a $50 million check.
Right.
And it's been great because a couple of my investors have basically used our fund as tuition, right? So we do charge, we have very, reasonable, economics, and very well aligned economics, which is more important. But nonetheless, it is an extra layer of fees, but people, will make that trade for the education that they get in the asset class sometimes. So we have several people who kind of come in, we introduce them to the managers, and then they go off and build their own program. People say, well, hey, CD, aren't you going to put yourself out of business? And I'm like, well, you know what? If I've plugged them into people and those people have been successful, then my returns will be great, which will, keep me in business. Now, the challenge of the fund of funds, and this is something that's different in Beezer's world. The challenge of the fund of funds is that you're constantly refreshing your LP base, not necessarily with every fund. We've had great kind of persistence, but often you have kind of people kind of coming and going. There's a lot of optionality at the investor level. It is interesting though, keying on something Beezer said, that fund of funds and family offices put a lot of emerging managers in business. And look, I was at Princeton's endowment for a while, and the rumors are true. We did actually shit chocolate ice cream and fart rainbows. Okay. I mean, we could get access to a lot of things because we had the big P on our chest. And so, these guys have there's a little bit of a conceit, not in a negative, value neutral way. There's a conceit that you can get into things in funds 3, 4, 5. Although I think that people overestimate their ability to do so. I think that's reserved for the U.S. News and World Report kind of top 25. And beyond that, by the time it's obvious enough for somebody to get really excited, because most people look at performance, and performance is a lagging indicator, not a leading indicator. By the time it's obvious, the fund's either too late or, long in the tooth enough that the GPs have called in rich.
Yeah. So if you look at the venture landscape, you have, firms that have very different approaches, different, theses, different ethos. Look at, a firm like Andreessen Horowitz versus a firm like Founders Fund versus a firm like Benchmark. Very different. In the fund to fund worlds, are there LPs differentiating on approach or thesis or ethos in a way that creates a good conversation for venture?
It's an interesting question. I don't know if LPs think about different. There are probably ways that different LPs, given who they are, think about what they invest in, but I think that has probably smaller levels of change between whether you're an endowment or a foundation or an asset manager. I mean, I do think there's some opportunities you can take advantage of when you are looking to be first in versus if I can come in 8 or 10 years later, but I don't know if they really are radically different. If people are investing to make strong financial returns, then that's going to be the lens that kind of coalesces to a point.
Well, I actually have a question for you, because you are so much I literally want to be a sponge for information for Beezer, because you are at the top of your game. Do you have I have my own little watchword, which I'll share, but what is the prism through which you look at managers? I would be very curious, when you wake up in the morning, you say, I'm looking for this type of footprint.
I have a catchphrase.
Do tell.
No, I say it all the time. It's super boring. Why you?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, because we ask this about ourselves, because there's obviously why do people pick us and why are we in this business? But it's the lens that helps us then say, what are you doing as an investor? Why are you here? Why is it you? Why is it your team? Why is it this opportunity set of entrepreneurs? Why will they pick you? Why will you make money? It sort of allows you to sort of go to the levels of team, market opportunity, portfolio construction. And we have a belief that if you are investing in something that's authentic to who you are and what you're going after, good things follow, right? It's just so natural. Like you'll be differentiated in a way that is super, super hard to compete with. And all of that kind of gets bubbled up into the why you.
And what are underrated or overrated answers to that question?
It's actually harder to answer than people think because there's some great quote that I can't remember, but I'm going to stall and then you will remember about self-reflection by like Plato or somebody. The unexplored life means nothing, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Chris is my,
the examined life.
The unexamined life. Yes. So usually Chris is my literature, my classical literature knowledge expert, so I can rely on him for the Latin phrase.
Our sound engineer is deep in philosophy.
Yes. But it actually is not an insignificant question.
Yes.
Right? And so I think it's harder for people to answer than they think. And I will posit that for a lot of people, and this is definitely an answer an LP would give, the thinking about the fundraising is not the primary thing that most VCs think about because they're thinking about their deals, which is logical and is exactly in many cases what should be happening. But then the time isn't taken to think of, well, how do I then explain why us to somebody who doesn't have to choose us?
Yeah.
I'll start by saying this. Beezer's a lot nicer than I am, right? Like she's actually like a better human being, which is why she can ask this question, why you? And I believe that she asks it with full inquiry, like on the inquiry to advocacy scale. It's all inquiry. I come from a crankier place. And my kind of angle is like, this is actually my prism. Give me a robust nonconformist with the courage of their convictions.
It's a long catchphrase.
It's a long catchphrase.
I might not remember all that.
And I think about the people I've backed and it's, some days I think my portfolio is a little bit of like land of the misfit toys because I over index on really robust nonconformists who by their very nature kind of have like sharp edges and are quirky in ways that maybe don't make them ideal for the cocktail party circuit, but get them real resonance with entrepreneurs. Beezer knows exactly who I'm talking about. So I won't use his name, but there's one guy that we've both invested in. And I once went to and I'm going to totally give it away by saying that I went to like a data scientists meeting. And literally like I walk in and the first guy I see is like, he looks like Hagrid from Harry Potter and he's wearing like a Slayer t-shirt, an Iron Maiden t-shirt. And he has like 2 PhDs, one from, CMU and the other from, Cambridge in philosophy, right? Like, this guy is like, savant. And, I start talking to him about this guy and this is several years ago. And he finally goes, look, he's not going to work with your kind of people. He's like, you're money people. Money people won't understand them. But with our people, he's part of the tribe. And I was like, oh, he's part of the tribe. Boom. This is my guy. And so literally that was the moment when the lights like, but it's not I'm going to ask you.
No, it's true. No, it is. There's that. You can't fake that kind of authenticity. Like it's just, you just can't. And it comes in all these different forms. Like you could argue that Kirsten Green at Forerunner maybe has data scientists with Slayer t-shirts on it. Who knows? But like she's got that same, and the team has that same sort of linearity of like, here's what we do, here's what we think, and the entrepreneurs flock to it, right? Jason Lemkin at SaaStr. Like there are these people that are just so notable in how they move around, right?
Beezer, do you believe in love at first sight? Like with managers?
VC and an LP?
I asked that question provocatively. I've known Beezer since 1991.
Wow.
But do you get love at first sight or does it build?
I think we've experienced both.
Yeah.
There's definitely times when there's an immediate connection and you're like, oh, this just lands.
Yeah,
right?
That's true.
And there's other times when the more you go back and you're like, oh, this is like you leave the meeting, you're like, that was interesting. And I'm sure this is exact correlation between VCs and entrepreneurs. And a week later, you're still like, that was a really interesting question. Right. And so like we were looking at New York, the metropolitan area, and we had a question around technology and how deep is the tech. And we kept running around it and running around it and running around it. And I blogged about this because that's when we ended up violating our rules around not doing smaller funds. And we did notation because I just couldn't kick the question that they were trying to go out of our heads. And it just landed, right? I mean, of course, we liked them when we first met them, but there was something about their thesis that we thought was just.
And the thesis was that there'll be big companies in New York and that they'll have access to them.
following the trend line around the technologists spinning out of existing companies in the ecosystem and doing companies based on a real technology backbone. And it could be any kind of company that wasn't predetermined, like what it would look like, but that the system had started with that. And that's what they're looking for. And we had the same question in our minds of, has the New York ecosystem reached that state now? Because I started my career in 2000 in a VC/incubator in New York in the meatpacking district, right? And all of it was just leveled after the big downturn. And so how deep was the ecosystem and had it rebuilt was a question that we were really hopeful the answer would be yes, but didn't know. And again, like this sort of questions keep coming up in your mind. So versus some of the other funds we've met collectively with Chris, we've worked together on occasion.
Yeah, every now and again. It's funny. I asked the question because I'm a little bit of a love at first sight kind of guy. I think when I met Josh Koppelman at the Conshohocken Marriott outside of Philly for the first time in 2005 or 6, literally walking out of that meeting, we were in the lobby and I said, Josh, if you didn't exist, I'd have to invent you. And then he said, Douvos, if you didn't exist, I'd have to invent you. And I felt like so bromantic. And then I thought about our friend with the data scientists, that was kind of love at first sight. But as I thought about it, as you were answering the question thoughtfully, sometimes these GPs like get under your skin, they wear at you and you like don't want to love them. And then all of a sudden you're like, yeah, there might be something there. And then, that's actually I was just telling a story to tell a story, but like actually I stumbled into like the takeaway from that is a great mentor of mine when I was doing public market stuff before business school said a great analyst has no ego. And, it's funny, a lot of people invest with ego. And I felt like, myself, when I've like had to change my mind, you really have to tuck your ego away. And that's a real challenge. And I think, as a result, you have to invest with humility. And, and really it's like in a sense, a labor of love. You have to invest with love and vulnerability and all that stuff. And that's hard.
Yeah.
Strong convictions, weakly held.
Yes.
Isn't that what we're all supposed to be?
Yes. Speaking of humility, we talked about, First Round, we talked about Data Collective, there are a bunch of others you guys have hit, from the beginning, put people in business. What are the ones, or what's something you've missed that you misread a signal? Or you don't know, going back, you said, oh, I wish if I saw this, obviously in hindsight it's 2020, but tell a story of something you missed.
So our platform is 7 years old, which in some respects it's wonderful because it allowed us to re-image some things that we think about. And if you can start fresh, you can kind of recreate yourself in a way that's very flexible. And we've really tried to use it to be in service to our GPs. But it means you just weren't around 40 years ago, right? So what's harder is when you want to look back in time, because 7 years, if we invest in a fund in 2012, most of them the data starts coming in sufficiently between the years 6 and 8. So like we can look to 2012 and be like, oh, what happened in that vintage? But before then, it's harder for us to answer that. But there's funds like First Round, right? Or Benchmark that ship is, for the LPs that are in it, that is an awesome ship to be in, right? But it's much harder for someone who's not part of that initial crew. So there's lots of activities like that. And, our goal is to make sure we catch them for the future so that we're there. But going backwards, I could list a long list of names of VCs where occasionally if you build a relationship and hang around the hoop effectively, you can get in. Because to Chris's earlier comment, there almost always are shifts in the LP base. For a whole host of reasons that if GPs want to hear about why it's actually not going to be the same way today as it is 20 years from now, we're happy to talk about. And we've been fortunate to sometimes take that advantage and to work with some new to us, but not new to the world. But generally speaking, it's tougher because it's just the performance data in 7 years is really brief.
It's funny. I was part of the group that said no to Excel at Princeton.
You're going to share the story.
But this actually isn't the story I'm going to tell because I actually don't have any regrets about it. We said no to Excel.
Tell the story anyway.
Well, not that. I'm not going to tell that story. That's a whole other story. Then I got to TIFF and we said no again. And that became the Facebook fund. So I said no twice to the, one of the best funds of the decade. And it's funny because I was playing golf a few years later once it became obvious with a guy who's a top of the Midas list kind of guy who I won't name. And he said, I was like, dude, what did I miss? And he goes, you missed absolutely nothing. You did exactly what a well-trained institutional investor would do given the data you had at the time. right? And for those who remember, XL is now XL, but at the time, kind of 2003, 2004, I had a lot of friends who had like this oh shit moment where they were like begging to get in. And then, everybody was bailing out. So they had a chance to get in. And then they got the books with the info and they're like, oh shit. And so, and Fenton had left and, there was a lot going on, but they turned it around. And this becomes for me, like, the secret of if you ask, I once asked the Yale guys what their secret of success in venture is. And Tim Sullivan, who ran private equity there for a long time, a really great dude, said, we get off this bus one stop too early rather than one stop too late. And that was always my philosophy. And then boom, I get kicked in the ass by XL. So, but I'll tell you, whatever, that was what it was. I don't have any regrets about that. The one I do have regrets over is Steve Anderson. And it was 2008 and he was spinning Baseline out. And it was really nice because I'd done a lot of things, in the ecosystem by then. I'd done First Round and, OATV and Floodgate and a bunch of others by then. And I went and met with Steve. Steve actually reached out cause he'd gotten a few, calls recommending. We had this great meeting, total meeting of minds. He's such an amazing guy, such a smart guy. And I went back to my investment committee and I said, I'd like to do Baseline. And there was a guy who shall remain unnamed on the committee, very, good public market investor, who's an endowment CIO. And he goes, Douvos, I think what you're doing with these seed funds is the triumph of hope over experience. He's like, I don't believe it. I just don't believe it anymore. Like, I've had enough. And he was like, look, you can do it, but this is like, a career risk kind of move. And it kind of like fucked with my worldview a little bit because I was like, wait, what? I'm like here to invest without the fear of being wrong and alone. Because if you're afraid of being wrong and alone, you'll never be right and alone. And that like seed of doubt, kind of went in my head. And then I kind of slow rolled Steve and then ended up saying no. And I don't think, I don't think he's ever looked at me the same way again. Which is really too bad because that was, Steve's an outstanding investor, outstanding guy and has had amazing success. And that's the one that got away.
Well, and your question is something we think about a lot today because ironically, there's not as many funds in the market now as there were back when I started in 2000. There were over 600 funds in the market and about, I don't know, I have a number down here somewhere, about, call it 17% of that were first-time funds. So there was a huge number of potential investable funds back then. So now we only have like a little over 200 every year now gets done. Many more first-time funds as a percentage, but still, given the avalanche of opportunity that's coming at it by all of these folks who are starting new funds and or I'm not even sure what the right word is, the remaking of many funds as people move in between existing platforms.
It's looking like NBA free agency. Or,
a little bit, right?
Trading,
and you're like, who's the next Steve Anderson? And how are you going to know? Because you could spend all day long just meeting with these 700 micro funds that are out there. And that doesn't even touch the Series A, Series B, Series C portion of the market. And so given the amount of the velocity of movement right now in the market, makes you really wonder what is going to get missed or not. Time alone, a decade from now, we can look back and know, but it's something we think about a lot is how do we actually manage in the ecosystem and still spend time with our existing managers and show up well. So actually, double clicking on that, an old mentor of mine, who's a public markets guy, he goes, well, what do you do when you're, by then I was at Princeton and doing, a fund of funds. I mean, an endowment is basically a fund of funds with one client. And he's like, so what do you do, right? When you're picking funds, what do you do? And I go, well, look, I'm trying to strip out skill from luck, right? And I've thought about that. And then I see the number of goofballs who did the one deal, the number of clowns that are in company X or Y. Uber has given birth to a lot of funds. I was going to say Uber, but I didn't want to point it. I don't want to point at anybody. Ones, but there's a lot, right? There's any company that's had an extraordinarily high up ramp in TVPI, even better if it's DPI, but I'll just keep waiting on that one. Exactly. Moolah and the Kula, baby. Right. And there's probably 50 investors, 100 investors, even more angels. So you just the network, I want to say network effect, but it's not really network effect. It's the off ramp of everybody is just amazing. Well, and that people ask me, I've been doing this for 18 years now, and people ask me, what is changed?
what has changed since?
I think Erik asked us that.
Funny that.
Yeah, please.
And the thing that's changed most for me is the proliferation of angel activity. And so anybody can, write 50 checks, and all you're trying to do is catch lightning in a bottle once. And then that's credibility enough to find some quasi-institutional pool of capital to give you money, it seems, right? And this actually suggests to me, and by the way, I call it dilettante capital, right? There are just a ton of people who have, they have entrepreneurial experience, and they're, founder friendly and all these things. And they've got their, AngelList portfolio, and, they go out and, do one great deal, and they think they can go out and raise institutional capital, not understanding that being an investor is a trade craft unto itself. And so I feel like the sophistication level, there's a great entrepreneurial energy. That's the upside. The entrepreneurial energy in the funds business is way up. And I think that's a very positive thing. But the sophistication is way down. And the amount of time I personally spend lecturing people, berating people, haranguing people about portfolio construction issues is remarkable. And by the way, Beezer, you're always so smart and Johnny on the spot with the data. How many new funds closed? Oh,
wait, I have it.
Well, how many funds last year? How many funds were raised last year?
Did not pull the last year number, but it's actually not that different from this year. So this is PitchBook numbers.
Yeah.
About 232 this year. And I can pull up my laptop and give you last year's number. I just didn't have it written down. But it wasn't that much more than last year, because it's been pretty solidly over 200 for the last few years. Like, it's just kind of at a good steady state, but.
So here's a question, right? Like, there are a lot of institutional LPs who define victory as being top quartile, right? I call this tyranny of the relativists, right? Like, you can be a winner and be top quartile. Well, when there are 200 funds, the 50th fund is top quartile. I think the 50th fund is going to struggle to, even, forget match the S&P 500, might even struggle to return capital in a distributed, DPI basis, right? I think that's a big challenge, and I'll get off my soapbox.
Well, I like what you said about the entrepreneurial activity in venture, because we've been thinking through about innovations in venture. And in some levels, the industry, like being the nature of venture capitalism, like as a venture capitalist as a job and LP as a job secondary, that is actually hugely unchanged, right? Because it's math. You put money in, you get money back. Like, it's just bounded, because unless we get into theoretical math, pretty restricted, right? But when you think about how funds have changed over time in trying to differentiate, and because we're in this bull market where there is no shortage of capital, right? Like, we might not be there could always be more, but it's a great time to be an entrepreneur. There's just a ton of money there, right? And how do you differentiate? So funds like Village Global are doing interesting things. First round was super different and changed the industry. And Andreessen, probably not the first people to think through doing value-added services, but like, God, did Sand Hill Road react when they showed up, right? That was like big burst of something had happened. And you see like thesis coming up and you see all these sort of ways of saying like, how do we actually stand out in a field where money is just, yes, money, as SoftBank Vision Fund has showed us, if you have enough of it, I guess it's a differentiator. but unless you're in the $100 billion category, the rest of us mere mortals, it's by definition fungible. So you have to do something besides that. Pick your poison. And that's sort of interesting, because it has sort of poked people into the thinking through like the why you and what are you going to do. And I think it's probably a net benefit to entrepreneurs. I mean, maybe it's confusing and there's a noise of venture capitalists, but having more people trying to think through how to be better at their job sounds like an ecosystem benefit. Yeah,
it's interesting. I think I put in 3 different buckets of how firms differentiate it in terms of, one is what you invest in, and that's Kristen Green and Forerun, picking a specific theme and owning that theme. 2 is what specific pool you invest in. So it's House Fund in Berkeley, or it's, Notation, and Nick Charles and Alex in New York, or it's how you operate as a firm, maybe in terms of how you add value to entrepreneurs, which is, in a general capacity, or how you source companies. So Village with the network leader model, or Andreessen, or First Round, et cetera. So with that in context, which of those, thematic, geography based, or sort of platform or novel approach are you most excited about? And broadly, how do you guys think about emerging managers? How do you approach it generally?
Well, we are guilty of liking to geek out over the data. And I can tell you that we haven't found an easy answer of saying do X and money will rain on your head. But we'd like to find that answer. So I don't think we're not super prescriptive as far as it should be X, Y, or Z, but we do look at in the totality if you're trying to approach a certain market. Like, so we've been longtime fans of Union Square. Like one of the originators of thesis, probably they weren't the first ones to do thesis-based investing, but they certainly have done a really badass job of it. Yeah. Right? But is everyone who then says I'm a thesis-based investor going to be amazing? Hopefully, but no, there's no guarantee. You can't pick a model and just say my model is going to.
You don't have a top down saying, hey, we're looking for a Vancouver based fund or we're looking for a AIML thesis.
No, but what would say is if you are in a certain area, and that could be geography in some situations, what's going on in that market and how do you play against it? And then sometimes we've done things. So we do US, Europe, and Israel, where we've made bets on funds in other geographies that we wouldn't necessarily have made in the Bay Area because there's advantages to being there or that play themselves. Like we are pretty straight down the road Series A investor the gross majority of the time in the Bay Area and, well, really in the US. But in Europe, we've done some seed funds and that we've ended up putting a fair bit of capital into because the velocity of fundraising is also faster. We think it's a competitive advantage in Europe and given what they're playing at and what they're doing. And it was a place of the market that we had a strong thesis around. But would that have played the same if they're in the Bay Area? Who knows? Right.
Well, my favorite Latin phrase is ubi panis ibi patria. Where there is bread, there is my country. And that's partially because
Is that a pizza reference?
Exactly. I've got a gluten problem. I'm on the high gluten diet. Anyhow, this is actually very often I think about where am I wrong? And I have had first a 180 and now maybe a second 180 to make a full circle.
So you're back where you started?
Back where I started. I was going to say, we shall not cease from exploration.
Who knew you're having a literary podcast?
Yes. Yeah. Well, by the way, speaking of geography, part of the reason I love California is I read Walt Whitman's Song of the Redwood Tree when I was in high school, and he said, in California, I see the genius of the modern, the child of the real and the ideal. And I think that's like the essence of what we do here, right? And Whitman says, I see populous cities and the latest inventions. What? That was 1850, dude.
I was reading Isabel Allende. Also great stories based on being out here and the whole movement out west, right?
Yeah. Isn't that awesome?
LPs in literature. That should be your podcast.
See, I was a history major, so, these guys all these CS guys from Stanford, they're a lot smarter than me, but I have good cocktail party conversation. So I was early in my career very excited about alternate ecosystems. So keep in mind, this is 01, 02. At Princeton, we did Ignition up in Seattle. By 04, I was a big investor in Madrona up in Seattle. Had looked a whole bunch of other places and done some investments in kind of second tier geographies. And those investments, the ones I mentioned have been fine, have worked out fine, but the ecosystems as a whole haven't developed. And I think about Seattle in particular, which again is fine. The Madrona guys have done really well, as have the Ignition guys. But it hasn't flourished the way I thought it would flourish as a startup ecosystem necessarily. Maybe it is starting to now, but I think because the essence of Silicon Valley is, a legacy of failure, right? Like you have all these diasporas, often from failed companies, right? That actually creates this kind of dynamism of people, whereas people get stuck at Amazon. It's a great place to be, but there's not a lot of flow in and out of Amazon. For a while, the most engineers per capita were in Boise, because I think Micron was up there. But there was no big ecosystem in Boise because everybody went to Micron and stayed there forever, right?
Ooh, HP had a big office there. When I worked at HP, Boise was where the printers were, I think.
Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, I really got excited about some of these alternate ecosystems and one day I was talking, excitedly I felt like, in my memory, I'm like a little boy in shorts wearing like a little cap with a propeller on it, talking to dad, who is David Swenson, at Yale. And I'm like, Mr. Swenson, I've got this great idea, alternate geographies. And he just, he's like, well, Douvos, why do you think that? And, here we go again. And he goes, why do you think that? And I go, oh, well, there's, kind of lower cost of talent. There's great talent to start with, great technologies, lower cost, less competitive intensity. I ran through this whole thing, and I said, in Seattle, it costs, 58% what it does, in the Bay Area to get a company to first revenue, whatever stat I threw out. And he goes, Douvos, you're playing a value hand in a growth game. And again, that like gobsmacked me. And I was like, whoa, maybe I need to be more momentum oriented. And that kind of changed my perspective. And then a lot of the funds I was tracking ended up being like really kind of unfulfilling. There are a lot of great people around the country who do good work, but there's not as much, kind of stupid head spinning optionality that's captured. And I created a thesis around why that is. And for like 7 or 8 years, like that was the thesis. And then you see like, a lot of groups using the geographic arbitrage, like finding companies elsewhere and bringing them to the Bay Area to kind of blitz scale here. And the whole blitz scaling, Lilly and Hoffman, like, those guys kind of changed my worldview. And more recently, I'm just like, wow, it's so friggin' expensive here to not only start a company, but to retain people. And look, somebody the other day said to me, like, the unemployment rate in the Bay Area for engineers is negative. Like, you can actually, as an engineer, hold 2 jobs and nobody will dare say anything to you for fear that you'll leave. And so it's like crazy. And that, and that gets
That is not true in the LP world.
So, anyhow, I've started to like rethink my my Bay Area centrism around clusters of excellence. So, where is it that there is, kind of a particular cluster and critical mass of technologists in a certain vertical, that could be interesting? Is there people talk about whatever it is, the I-65 cluster, right? Like with kind of healthcare and some of the stuff going on there. Is there, what's going on in Austin? What are its particular attributes? That's, where I'm kind of underweight now.
It's interesting because we believe, and I think everything in my life reinforces this from an N of 1, is that innovation knows no boundaries, right? So and the fact that the world is more transparent and you can see things and the whole cost of you can create so much more on your own in your backyard, all of that would increase the likelihood of great companies starting really absolutely anywhere. But there is something about the health, not even not the health, but the layers in the ecosystem that are necessary to build a company, and who are the managers that are going to come in at different stages, and what's the experience set. And that seems to be, I remember I read a book I wish I could remember the professor's name because Chris would remember if he was me, but it was called Setting the Table. And it went through all these things that sounded super boring, like regulation and tax and all this stuff that needs to be true for people to switch jobs and have 2 jobs at once. So like all this stuff in these other ecosystems in the US, state by state, and other countries, they just needed to sort of turn the dial. Because people always say to me, don't we need to help promote bringing venture to an ecosystem? I'm like, yeah, let people make money, right? Not in illegal ways, like, do all the right things, but like, people will find opportunities and maybe they move them, maybe they don't. But if you facilitate business creation and decreation, if you allow people to fail, because a lot of countries are much more, they really punish you if you go bankrupt. And the US is somewhat unique in this respect. And that's part of why we're a more fertile place to start and stop businesses.
So this fluidity of, particularly people, but, kind of economic fluidity, as you said, is kind of unique to the United States. But what has caused me to be like historically so California focused is that California Supreme Court has been over and over and over, steadfast that any kind of non-compete is restraint of trade, right? And
they might not feel that way about carried interest.
Oh, don't get me started. I bet carried interest is going to get taxed before I ever see $1 of it. Oh, well. Neither here nor there. But yeah, the kind of, non-enforceability of non-competes is a real, kind of, competitive advantage, I think, for California particularly. And then you talked about kind of cultural stuff, which is why I was always so cynical about New York, because New York felt like a bonus culture, whereas California always felt like an equity culture, right? But, I was thinking like, what's changed in my own kind of view? Like, why am I more optimistic? And it's there's just so much more information, right? Like if you think about venture in the 80s, it was a dark art, right? Like, Reed Dennis and, these guys on, Burton Burge and all these guys on Sand Hill Road would like, mwahaha, they've got this, bubble, toil and trouble, right? It was like this cauldron that they had. And now you can listen to podcasts like this and, Brad Feld's done an amazing job. Like, Josh Koppelman in the early days, we could go. And now everybody's, blogging and podcasting, and there's just so much information out there that I think it's really flattened the world.
Well, the one thing that I don't know when it's going to tip sufficiently to change the ecosystem, but I worry about a lot of things, and I just add this to the list, is that you're talking about the bonus culture versus the equity culture. And as companies stay private longer and layer the value of people's options, at what point are we going to flip? And then people will be basically salary and bonus, the same way I was back in the old days at HP, right? Which is totally fine and traditional in the way it was. And I even had a pension being accumulated and like all the goods. That's not what the startup industry and the venture industry did their math based on. So if the math changes at somewhere in the middle, but not the top or the bottom, like, is that going to be a real challenge? And all of it's being triggered by this, you never have to really exit. Or if the folks that are exiting are a thin layer, or maybe it's going down sufficiently down the stack, and that's going to keep things healthy. But I think we're watching those dynamics. I think it can just really make life different for an employee in a startup that may or may not be getting the deal they thought they were. And when I worry about our industry, I worry about that, because if people don't want to work at startups, that's the biggest problem. I don't worry about venture capitalists. I don't worry about LPs. Like, it's the people in the companies that are going to be where the focus should be.
It's funny. I've had a couple of friends recently ask me about joining certain startups, and I tell them, like, you got to get a sense for the cap table and the preference stack. Because if you're going to come in with an option package, you need to know where you are in that line. And I think that you're exactly right. Like, there's this magic, right, that people think about. They think about, this. In fact, I always say, in the venture industry or in the startup world, we use, lottery slogans with Ivy League veneer. So, optionality is the same thing as, hey, you got to be in it to win it, right? And so, hey, you never know, right? Like is the same thing as asymmetric, outcome. We've got this whole, it all takes is $1 and a dream and maybe, maybe some preferred shares. Anyhow, so I do, that's a big, huge worry of mine.
A few questions. One is, how do you guys think about defensibility within venture firms as they evolve? Do they actually build real defensibility? Is it only brand? Is it something else?
I think I feel different ways on that on different days. To be the brutal honesty is sometimes you look at the permanence and the the preservation of. Let me say it this way: the permanence of brand is amazing, right? And it can carry firms through some tough times, sometimes that's great, and sometimes people will come and say something. You're like, have you caught up on the news lately? Like, not entirely sure that firm stands for what it stood for before.
Well, I wanted to ask specifically about Kleiner.
Interesting.
Because I was also going to ask about firm reinvention. You mentioned earlier when Fenton left Excel. How do you guys think about, can a firm like Kleiner weather that and be at the same place that they were? Can they rebuild? How do you look at firms that have, I don't want to say lost their way, but people have left and now it's just a changing of the guard?
Can I use one of my favorite Chris Douvos' quote? My crystal ball is in the shop. I mean, the amazing thing about venture is and it's why it's so constantly intriguing, is it is constantly changing. And unless there's sometimes things go so horribly wrong, and this isn't necessarily a comment on any particular firm, and you're like, that's going to be tougher, right? Because they haven't had the historical performance. They don't have the install base of LPs, and we can talk about how one leverages that. How to be thoughtful about putting LPs into your firm such that you increase the odds of having them coming back. And there's some you're like, okay, this is clearly they're going to have a hard time raising. But other times, your example about Facebook is great. Like, one company can change the stars for the next 25 years. And if we could call what company that was, we'd have all sorts of other opportunities ahead of us. Right. I don't know. What's your take on that? Now that I stole your quote.
Oh, no, you stole it and made it better and made it your own. I love it. I think that one of the truisms in finance is that the assets press the elevator button at the end of the day and walk out the door. And it amazes me that firms like Benchmark actually have been able to stay at the top of their game with a rotating, group of people. And I think in that case, right, there are some cultural elements to it in the way they structure themselves and the way they, they recreate themselves. Whereas there are other firms where the founding partners called in rich and the next generation sucks, right? And so it really is idiosyncratic, which I think is why Beezer and I on a daily basis, earn our pay. Because staying on top of these are people businesses, and understanding these folks and their behavioral footprints and their, kind of change over time in a very, intimate way is kind of key to the voodoo that we do. I am always puzzled when people start their evaluation of a fund with track record, because by the time something becomes apparent, the people that did it, were at a very different place in their lives, had different behavioral footprints potentially. What is it that they say? Like every 7 years, your body is entirely different on a cellular basis. There are no cells that are right. And, obviously, as the Romans might have said, numen semper ad est. The spirit is always there.
Damn, Moreland. Vinny, Vicky, something. I took it in 7th grade. But I would say the part that's so amazing is still that there isn't a great place to go to learn. I mean, these podcasts and things are wonderful. But when people say, you meet entrepreneurs who sort of life before Facebook didn't really exist. And yet there is a long history there. And some of it may be irrelevant. But sometimes when people talk about companies that a firm did, you're like, well, that actually isn't the people that are there. Or somebody new has come and it's changed the dynamic of the firm in a positive way or negative way. That depends. But the ability to do homework on this is really limited because everyone only knows certain range of people. And if you want to know the entrepreneurs, it could be a firm changes its stripes a bit in what they invest in. And that could be great news or not great news. Yeah. And they might attract a whole different kind of entrepreneur. So the folks over there, and it's sort of this interesting mishmash. And I'm with Chris on it really is maybe at a super high level. There are some firms like Sequoia and Benchmark that seem to have amazing management of succession over the generations. Yeah. But I would posit I would even be surprised if there is a baker's dozen of funds that have managed succession and and I say that even though track record is a lagging indicator, have had multiple 3x net funds through different people making those decisions, because it is probably the hardest thing to do in venture.
Have you seen a firm that was at the top of their game and then dropped out of, and maybe it's, firms that were classically great like Mayfield or August or Trinity or something, then get back into the top? Or is it pretty hard to do that?
Oh, it's an interesting question. It is really hard. Succession is extraordinarily difficult for a huge number of human reasons. And also, I really wanted to get a PhD in organizational behavior, so I'm going to own where this comes from. I actually think that venture firms, there's no reason why a lot of the good business books that apply to companies that make widgets don't apply to venture. Yet, I think most people think about their job as to invest capital, not in building a firm. And that might work at a certain size, but when you have 25, 50 people in an entity and you want to be around for 40 years, we have a belief that it matters. And if people aren't focusing on that, they could, by virtue of investing in Uber, make a ton of money and it's irrelevant because once money starts raining down, nobody cares. The details go away, right? It's a great absolver of, did you actually show up and treat your employees well, right? Which was also part of the dynamic of venture, which makes it really hard. But there actually aren't that many amazing companies that then come back into every fund. If there were, there would be a lot higher. The top quartile would actually have much bigger numbers than 2.1, 1.7, right? It's indicative of it's not really there in the industry. So therefore, again, it's super hard to put the data against this, but we have a belief that how you manage your firm when you've got these sort of more bodies than just a couple and successive funds really does matter, and it's going to help you, right? It doesn't just matter in some weenie way, but you'll actually get better returns if this is true. And you'll have LPs stick with you during the tough times, because there can be nobody had a great return in 2002 and 2003. It was just bad, right? There's times when it's just bad news, but who's going to stick with you is also part of the relationship. Well,
actually that's a great point. The management of venture firms is so unsophisticated. And, the thing that somebody said to me once when I was very early, actually Sam Colella, who's at Versant, longtime IVP guy then at Versant, Sam said, a lot of great venture firms are managed like basketball teams, but the majority of firms act like tennis teams where everybody's playing their own match. And so the dynamics associated with that are, are very different in terms of, kind of partner cohesion and whatnot, as opposed to a bunch of different fiefdoms. And what is amazing is that LPs actually have a lot more visibility because, by the way, as LPs, one of the things in our job description is we have to be really good gossips. And so we jibber jabber about GPs all day long. I mean, we know about all your shenanigans, guys. What surprises me is how quickly LPs are willing to abandon firms when performance is bad and the people are nasty and arrogant. So there's a firm right now that's raising, and I was talking to a decent sized investor in that firm, and they said they're going to pass. And I said, what's going on? He goes, the performance is so-so, but we really hate dealing with those sons of bitches. And I'm like, wow, that's actually like,
that's hardcore.
That's hardcore. I'm
For
like,
LP language, that's like really, that's like,
oof. But in a world right now where, one group I talked to the other day, an LP, an institutional investor, is at, it's an endowment type investor. They're at 19% NAV in venture, and their target is 7, right? And all of a sudden, when you're like at that level, you can actually start to care about if GPs treat you like shit. Now, I don't have any ego about it. Like, I don't care if, if Doug Leone comes over and sticks a thumb in my eye, I'd still say, please, sir, might I have some Sequoia? He's a swell guy. But I could, imagine. But
you and a whole long line of people.
Exactly. But I always think, if you treat LPs like that, how do you treat entrepreneurs, right? There is a level of, humanity that, that is core to this business, right? Understanding people's behavioral footprints is kind of what we do. And, when people are, really arrogant, really dismissive and not thoughtful about their business and just, kind of, Henry McCants at Greylock, one of the greatest investors, of his era, said to me once, he goes, Douvos, when capital becomes cheap, and time is expensive, look out. He goes, venture works really well when time is cheap and capital is expensive. And so, says, and when you have the reverse, look out. And I feel like time has gotten really expensive. And I think that, as the tide goes out, we'll actually see who's swimming naked.
Right. Is there too much money in the asset class, or how should we think about
Depends
that?
on who you are. If you're an entrepreneur, no.
Right.
Bring it on. Right.
From your perspective, Beezer, how should we think about it?
It's an interesting balancing act. I don't know how you draw the TAM of like, oh, there's only this many good ideas and they only need this much money. So it's sort of an unknowable, but it does feel like what's happening is with the money all going at the growth rounds. We're actually having this conversation this morning, which is everybody looks at the same PitchBook numbers, Crunchbase, pick your data source. And the majority of the money that's going into venture, and this is in the US and it's in Europe, probably true in Israel. I haven't seen the numbers yet. It's going in at the later rounds. And there's fewer seed deals and there's fewer Series A. So maybe if you're trying to get seed money, it's not as great a time. And I do find this confusing because yet there are always new funds starting. They tend to be small. So I haven't yet squared that. But it did make us think this morning, like, oh, this could be a really good time to be a Series A investor or like a later seed. Because if everyone's trying to write their $50 million check into this growth round and there's fewer companies coming out, we're like, I mean, yes, this is self-serving. We invested the Series A, but we do try to keep stress testing it and saying like, are we in the right portion of the stack? Which is a long-winded way of saying, in some respects, there's never enough money. And there's other times where as a human and as a geek of PhD, OB behavior, if you dump hundreds of millions of dollars into a system that doesn't know how to handle it because they haven't been asked to handle it, don't be surprised if things break.
We haven't even gotten to crypto yet.
No, totally. But I'm saying like in a firm, like if you handed us, like any human, here is like 100 times the money your budget calls for. Good luck. Right? Like as an organizational process standpoint, like it just that, yes, the extraordinary people will figure it out. But for a lot of just humans doing human things, that's just the companies could be less successful, one could argue, than if they actually had the amount they needed. Right. That's my polite answer. Now Chris is going to say something like way more cranky.
No, I think, I just go back to Buffett's equation, which is opportunity equals value minus perception, right? And what's happened is, we've gotten to the point where you can shine such spotlights on companies that the perception really blows out. The values, doesn't, grow. necessarily as quickly. And so as a result, the opportunity shrinks, right? And the problem is that it all works in a closed system like venture, but at some point we got to put moolah in the kula, right? So we've got to get these companies, we've got to find the greater fool to buy this. And it's either in an M&A, transaction or in the public markets. And
do we have any public markets?
I know, right? It's
crickets are chirping. Can the government come back?
Oh my God. Don't get me started. And by the way, my one editorial is, Trump's wall is, fourth century, solution for a 21st century problem. I hear his latest requisition for the Air Force, he's asked for a bunch of biplanes. Same thing, right? It's like old solutions to new problems.
And to your comment before, there's multiple LPs that I know who are saying, well, I have X, Y, and Z in my portfolio. Right. And now it's going to go public, and that will relieve the ability to use money to distribute to something else, like, I don't know, children, like hospitals, like all sorts of stuff, plus reinvest back into venture. And if none of this occurs, you're like, ooh, this could be painful, right? On so many levels in so many ways, but the industry was kind of counting on some liquidity coming through.
Well, this is my, kind of exit sphincter.
Yes.
Analogy, right? Like we keep stuffing the snake, and the sphincter is tight, and the snake's just getting bigger, and the poop isn't coming out the back end to fertilize the new fields, right? But LP nirvana is when you're, recycling distributions. It's circular. And, as we have disruptions in the flow of funds, and especially now when, everybody is so far out everybody who's got a mature program is so far out over their skis because funds have been coming back faster and bigger, and NAVs have been ballooning, and the money hasn't been coming out the back end. And, we'll look back, we'll listen to this podcast again in 5 years, and we'll, then be able to judge whether this was just a passing phenomenon or a, harbinger of a more kind of, sand in the gears of the, of the system.
Or we'll start dividending. Like the system will have to shift.
Yeah. Well, that's right.
But then it begs more questions than we have time for, because it kind of goes to like, well, why would you set up a system that uses a high velocity exit and use dividends, because that's what already exists in a sort of slower growth world. So that the two don't seem aligned, but I'd have to sharpen my pencil to figure out how to make it work.
But back to the kind of, is there too much money question? I'm actually, in a sense, optimistic about it. In the following way, like there should be secondary exit transactions in the way that the buyout ecosystem segmented into microcap buyouts, small, lower end of the middle market. And some of these companies get traded up the stack, and maybe we start to see that. Or we've seen, private equity firms like Vista's been really active.
We're seeing it all the time now.
Which is great. So more capital in that way is great. The thing I caution, I tell my GPs this all the time, you've got to worry about the clientele effect. And what I mean by that is, who is coming into your round and what are their return expectations? And I don't think a lot of people are very thoughtful about that. And I don't think they realize that when Fidelity comes into a round, their return hurdle is a lot lower than yours, Mr. Seeds or Miss Seed Stage Fund. And as a result, that you need to calibrate that, because every dollar demands a return, but some people's dollars demand a larger return, and mine demand a really big stinking return.
Yes. So maybe we'll just close with your work, the Open LP movement. What have you guys been trying to do? Where can we expect it to go?
Where do we want it to go? It's a great question. Can I tell the origin story?
Please.
So the origin story, I think it was probably at the diner, probably the Creamery in Palo Alto, because I've been known to be able to find Chris and I there on occasion. And we were talking about how people want to know what LPs have to say, apparently because, as Chris said, there's a lot of gossip to be had. But we were thinking probably slightly more benevolently. And the level of like the opacity in the system, I was opening up between entrepreneurs and VCs, thanks to all the blogging and all that. So Chris said, and I want to give credit where credit's due, we should have a hashtag so people could follow it on Twitter. And then we were ideating around it, and I had a team that could help me work on us. And then we put together a website and a URL, so there could be an open LP. And then we went through to our friends that were LPs that do blog and that do tweet, and just collected. So you can go to the website, and it just is a collection of where people have put material somewhere else. Because a lot of LPs are registered investment advisors, so the SEC cares how you talk and when you talk, so you have to make it a compliant platform. And then for those folks like Chris that tweet a lot, there's a hashtag, and then people can follow it. So those are the mechanics. But the idea really was to increase the transparency throughout the ecosystem, because, and again, our perspective is the LP world is a relevant point of intersection. And it hadn't been super transparent. And this doesn't mean violation of confidentiality agreements. It means sharing basic information of how does the whole 360 of capital flow. So we just wanted to do that for the industry. And it seems to have gone well. And it's actually one of our 2019 questions is what do we do next? So I don't know. What do you want to do?
Podcast.
I love it.
TV show.
Oh, that would be amazing. I think Beezer's spot on. Like transparency is key. And for me, it was like almost a little bit more commercial, not commercial. What's the word I'm looking for? Practical, because the number of GPs that come in and start pitching me and just start blasting away and have no idea, what I want or to hear about or what I need is amazing. And, like rule number one when you're making a sale is like know your customer. And so I was pushing back on this guy because he came in and just started plathering on. I'm like, you have no idea about, what I'm interested in or whatever. And he was like, well, how would I? And I'm like, well, I blog, right? Like and tweet. So you can pick that up. But, but it's not about me. It was about kind of, broadening the perspective to actually to spur better conversations because we spend so much time, kind of bullshitting in each other's directions. Let's actually.
I thought you were going to say educating, but okay.
No.
Potato.
No, that's right.
But no, but it's true. Like we can spend a lot of time educating / bullshitting about how the industry works because it's super hard. Like I had a friend today who was like, I want to talk to family offices. Where do I go to find out about them? And I was like, not my forte. But here's somebody who's in a family office who's happy to talk to you about the ecosystem. And that's why OpenLP's there. The big question is, do you create something that people can self-publish to? That's sort of the open-ended question because the idea is to get more and more people sharing. And there's a lot of good VCs that write are basically LP perspectives or how do you do X, Y, and Z and pull all this stuff in so that folks have a resource.
Awesome. Beezer, Chris, this has been a great episode. Thank you for coming on and educating our audience. For people who want more, follow them on Twitter, read their blogs. Guys, thank you so much for the work that you do.
Thank you.
If you're an early stage entrepreneur, we'd love to hear from you. Please hit us up at villageglobal.vc/network catalyst.